Good morning, Fearless. My name is Milt Becknell, and I have the privilege of being the third in a series of three speakers here on the topic of grief and loss. Chris started us out a couple of weeks ago looking primarily at the unavoidability of grief and how it's a part of each of our lives. And Lane gave us some great tips last week about how we're to be a buffalo and not a cow. Some very vivid images that I carried with me. I hope you did too. And he also gave us some great suggestions about how to come alongside those who are grieving and to do so in helpful ways. Today I'll be sharing several things here. Number one, I'm going to share some lessons learned from my grief journey after losing my wife Virginia on June the 17th, 2019. It'll be almost 6 years since she died. She died from it was described as a rare, aggressive, and fatal cancer. And it metastasized to her lungs. It was basically the lung cancer that took her life. But the thing that's so interesting and I think amazing and important to focus on here a bit today, as I tell my story, is that she died within 7 days of symptom onset. She was walking the neighborhood 45 minutes a day, lifted weights twice a week. She was a semi-vegetarian. She was very health conscious, and this thing just came out of nowhere, and it took her life. Started out as what we thought was a cold and bronchitis. Now, let me just stop here and say that if you've got a cold or bronchitis, it does not mean that you've got lung cancer, okay? It's a low probability, but it was just one of those things. In Virginia's case, she died from it. And it was that very low probability thing that actually came to fruition in our situation. So who am I? Why am I here? I've served as an elder here at Fearless. And I've been involved in community groups for a number of years. And we moved to the church, which was in Far Hills, in 2012. And many of you know Virginia. I mean, some of you have been around here long enough to know her. Some of you have not. And I'd like to introduce you to her at this time. It's kind of my way of honoring her memory, and also sharing some things that I think are important. And I mentioned also that I'm an Air Force clinical psychologist. I retired from the Air Force, and I had a second career as a psychology professor at Cedarville University. I'm still involved there on a part-time basis as an adjunct. I stopped doing that in 2017, and I had a private practice in Centerville when I was teaching full-time from 2004 to 2019. We came here in 1997 with PCS, and that's military speak for we moved here. And even though we've been here all this time, I still have people approach me and say, "You're not from around here, are you?" It's like the southern accent. I'm from the deep south originally. We spent many years in Texas. And I mentioned being an elder and so on, but if I can introduce you to Virginia. This is a picture of us in better times. This was at our anniversary, our 45th anniversary, September of 2018 at Fleming's. Now, if you've ever eaten at Fleming's, it's a memorable experience in many ways. They give you this thing called a free picture, but if you've ever eaten there, there's nothing free about this picture, okay? It's a little bit on the pricey side. The food is great, but it was a memorable night, and I like this picture, and I look at it, I keep it where I can see it every day, and it gives me good memories of that night that we shared together. Again, we didn't know that was going to be our last anniversary to celebrate together. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that I have 3 adult children, one of whom is here today, and I'm glad she can make it. That's my daughter, Kelly. And my son, Scott, and his family is traveling. They couldn't be here. And my son, Mark, who lives in Minnesota, couldn't be here as well. But Virginia was a high school English teacher. And most of her teaching was at Kettering Fairmont. She taught at some other schools along the way as we moved around. But basically, she stopped teaching in 2015. And she was, in a word, a bibliophile. Now, bibliophile means she loved books. Filio, love books, biblio. She inhaled books. I mean, she just was a voracious reader, and she had a lot of great insights, and she loved teaching high schoolers. She was also what's called an Anglophile, and that may not be a word that you use every day. She loved everything British. the Brit Lit thing, as she called it. And we had the opportunity to go a couple of times over to Great Britain with classes that I was teaching. We would take students over there from Cedarville, and she was just in her element. She loved that accent, okay? And in my house, we watched a lot of British movies, British sitcoms, British everything, you know? And I got to where I could almost understand it most of the time. If you watch the Brit, sometimes it's kind of hard with the different dialects with Scotland and Ireland and so on. They all have a unique way of speaking. But she loved all that stuff. And what happened was that she had what we thought was typical cold symptoms. And the doctor put her on some antibiotics and said, go on to this family reunion. We went to northern Michigan to meet up there with the whole family. We had this great place, and we had been there before, and it was just something we were really looking forward to. But 2 nights later in Michigan, she woke me up and said, I'm not breathing well. This doesn't feel right. It's not just a cold. So we went to one of the hospitals up there near Traverse City, and basically they said, you got some suspicious looking things. You probably ought to go home and have it checked out a little more closely. We drove home the next day, which was a Monday, and then it's like a 6-hour drive, and she got an appointment the next morning, and it didn't seem like an emergency at that point. I did my thing, she did hers, and she called me about an hour later and said they sent me to Soin, to the ER. They said my oxygen levels are low, and promptly drove over there, better there in the ER. We got in, they did their assessment, and that's when they hit us with the first big gut punch. They said, you have fluid on your lungs. It's in the pleura, the sacs where the lungs sit, pressing against the lungs, displacing them so she couldn't breathe. She said, we can take that off. That's not a problem. But the other thing that's a little bit of a complicating factor is you have numerous suspicious-looking lesions in your lungs, very suggestive of lung cancer. Now, bear in mind, this was a shock for many reasons. Number one, she had never been a smoker. I'd never been a smoker. Neither one of us had asbestos exposure and radon, which I'd never heard of radon until I moved to Ohio, but all the houses we've lived in have radon mitigation systems in them. Radon can be a contributing factor when there's poor health, but most of the time it's not that significant. She had no really precipitating events or symptoms that would point to lung cancer, and it was something that we were just incredulous about. We were trying to figure out what's going on here. And one thing led to another, and he said, she said, we need to admit you. So she stayed in the hospital. They took the fluid off. They did that a couple of times that week. And every day she got just a little bit worse. It was not like downhill, but every day she'd get a little better, get a little worse, a little better, a little worse. But it was a gradual decline that we had to watch. And we were all just kind of mystified by this because, like I said, she was, 2 weeks before, she'd been doing her normal kind of routine. And things came on very suddenly. Well, they said, we're going to put this device implant this device in your lungs that will siphon off the fluid, and you'll be able to breathe a lot better. And we think it's a thing to do. And we were like, let's do it, And they said, it's no big deal. They'd taken the fluid off a couple of times. Sunday morning, I got there about 8:30, and we, been together the night before. I usually stayed a few hours in the morning and a few hours in the evening to bedtime. And when I left her the night before, we prayed together, we kissed goodnight, and we talked a little bit. And I'll see you in the morning. I'll be up eating breakfast when you get here. Well, when I got there, they were wheeling her out of her room, taking her to ICU. And it was, like, what's going on here? And she had the big thing. She had been intubated. And they said, when they tried to put the device in to implant this chest tube to drain the fluid, that she had a laryngospasm, that her throat basically shut down, and they had to do a forced intubation, heavily sedate her, and put her on a ventilator to breathe her, because that way, heavy sedation so they don't fight the ventilator. In other words, she was unresponsive at that point. And they moved her down to ICU. I followed her down there. I started contacting, the local adult children and family and so on. And basically, when we got down there, this guy pulled me aside, and I'll never forget. The guy said, your wife's not going to make it out of here. He was very matter of fact about it. I don't think he meant to be cruel or harsh, but he said, your wife is dying. She's not going to make it out of here. She might make it through the night, but most likely not going to make it through the night. Her heart's just going to get weaker, and it'll stop. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? Dying? She had a cold. She had bronchitis. No, it's lung cancer. And he said, this lung cancer was much worse than we thought. It metastasized from her liver, and it was an aggressive cancer. Basically, it had taken over all her visceral organs and her brain, and it was killing her. It happened so fast, I cannot tell you how stunned I was. And the family got there about this time, and we were all trying to process what the heck is going on. And we had to deal with the fact that my soulmate, my best friend for 45 years, she was dying. She was going. Now, I didn't have any doubt about where she was going to go when she died, but that was just a bit much to process. And I was stunned, as anybody would be. We were all in disbelief, and we had to start saying goodbye to her. We took our private time with her to say goodbye, and they told us, they said, she may hear you and she may not. We don't know. We know that very likely she can hear you at some level, but it's going to be a lot of noise in there with all this sedation she was on. But essentially what we had to do was start the process of saying goodbye to this woman that we all loved, my wife, their mother. And it was a very difficult thing to do. And we did it. And then at 4:09 the next morning, Monday morning, the very day we were supposed to see the oncologist to negotiate treatment for the lung cancer, she died. And when it was over, it was a mixture of sadness, overwhelming sadness, just a little bit of relief. Because after somebody's going to die, then it's a matter of kind of getting your head around it and accepting it. And that's when the work really begins, because there's a finality to it. It's just really kind of hard to put it into words. So this is a picture here of happier times, and it reminds me there were good times, but sometimes they come to an end. A few things I want to share here today with you. Grief is a statement that we love somebody. If we didn't love somebody and we lose them, it wouldn't hurt so bad. And it hurt when I lost her. And I'm a college professor, so this is a test item here, okay? For those of you that are listening, the 3 N's of grief, okay? It's a natural experience. It's a necessary experience. And it's a normal experience. And, I'm not trying to make light of something serious. I'm just saying that we need to remember this. It's something that we all need to do, and it's helpful for us to do. And we want to practice what lawyers call due diligence, and this would be doing the work we call grief work. And this allows us to move toward healing and acceptance. And let me just say some semantic fine points here. We've talked a lot about working through grief and how, you don't really graduate from it, but we work through it. You can't go around it, over it, under it. You have to go through it. Another way of thinking about that is that we really don't work through it because we don't graduate from it. Another way to think about it is we work with it. We just kind of develop a relationship with it, and over time, it becomes less intrusive if we do the grief work. It does take time, though. It hurts a lot at first, but gradually over time, by the grace of God alone, He equips us to move on through it. And it's been called the dull ache of absence. The dull ache of absence. I think I just lost, there we go. Sometimes they'll come on like pangs. Grief comes on in waves. It might be an ankle deep, it might be knee high, it might be chest high, but they come on. And there's a lot more intensity early on, and they gradually reduce in intensity. But there's that dull ache there. So it's perfectly normal for us to ask, God, why did you let this happen? What did I do? Why her and not me? Wives are supposed to outlive their husbands. That's what the actuaries say. Sometimes it just doesn't work that way. I was 4 years older. I was supposed to go first. And we had the talk. What if you go first? What if I go first? And that's kind of an awkward situation, but it is something that we all need to do. These 2 verses here kind of remind us, I think, of the obvious, but they're things that we need to ponder very intentionally, that we're all going to die. Hebrews 9:27 says we're all going to die, men and women. We'll die once, and then comes judgment. If we know the Lord personally, if we have a relationship with Him, we're going to get in. I'm pretty confident of that. I think the Bible states that pretty clearly. But we get rewards depending on the way we've lived our lives, the kind of choices that we've made, and so on. Psalm 116:15 is kind of a peculiar verse in my mind, but I think it's a reminder how much God loves us. He says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of His loved ones. It's precious to Him. Not that He likes it, but He's there. He's near, and He is, I think, hurting in some ways the same way that we are. So, regarding God's will, one of the questions that comes up, and this is a biggie, okay? Why did he let this happen? You know, as we reflect on this. One way of kind of getting perspective on it, I think there's a theologian by the name of Gary Friesen. He's a PhD from Dallas Theological Seminary, and he taught at Multnomah School of the Bible for many years, which no longer exists, but it was just a bastion of good conservative Bible teaching for many years. He said that there's two kinds of will. One kind is God's moral will. The other kind is God's sovereign will. God's moral will is given to us in his word. It's accessible to us. It gives us warnings. It gives us encouragement. It gives us wisdom, guidance. It's accessible to us. God's sovereign will, on the other hand, is really not accessible to us. That's those questions like who lives and who dies. You know, why do some people have more trouble than others, and so on and so forth. We don't know that. We kind of have to let him be the judge of it. But there's this process that goes on where we have to yield, I think, as Christ followers, to God's sovereign will. We don't know what it is, but we have to yield. We don't want to fight it. And it's sovereign in the sense that it overrides everything. God invites us to ask. This is where it becomes kind of interesting questions here. We're reminded that he invites us to ask. There's a couple of verses that I want to cite here, in particular, 3. I'll go on to the last one in a moment. But James 4:2 says, you have not because you ask not. We can ask for stuff. He invites us to ask. John 15:7, if you abide in me and my words abide in you, you can ask whatever you want. It's yours. So we're given these promises, but how does that translate? You know, what about life and death here? King Hezekiah in 2 Kings 20 has an interesting story there where King Hezekiah was about to die. His health was failing. And he said, Lord, I'm not ready. Let me live a little longer. And God said, okay. He said, you can have 15 more years. Now, when I read this, I think, well, why not 10? Why not 25? You know, we don't know. That gets into the domain of God's sovereign will that we do not really have access to. And I can tell you that when Virginia was dying, I asked God to spare her in no uncertain terms. And now we had many people praying, heal her. Let her stay with us a little longer. And what did he say? Well, God answers prayer in 3 ways. He says, yes, you got it. You want 15 more? Here's 15 more years. Well, we didn't get 15 years. We didn't make it through the night, when things got complicated. Sometimes God says no. When we pray for healing, when we pray for deliverance, he says, no, you can't have that. That's not what I have for you. Sometimes God mysteriously says, not right now. Wait. And I think these are subtle, but they're very important reminders of our relationship with a heavenly, sovereign God. We're presumptuous. We're invited to ask, but he reserves the right to say yes or no or wait. And we need to submit to that. Have you ever noticed how whenever we start talking about death, people get real quiet? It's kind of a somber, morbid topic, morose. It's kind of like not ready to go there. Sometimes humor can lighten the moment a little bit. Woody Allen's got a great line. The great philosopher Woody Allen. He says, I'm not afraid of my own death. I just don't want to be there when it happens. And I think he's got a little element of the truth in that it's an uncomfortable topic. We're spending 3 sessions on it, and we keep coming back to it here. But there's a certain fragility that we have with age. And our mortality is something that we don't know where it's going to end. Now, again, I'm a psychologist. I want to share a little psychology with you here. Some of you will recognize this name, Eric Erickson. If you ever had general psychology or developmental psychology, and I'm seeing some heads nod here, these are things you have to memorize when you take these courses, and they're often on licensure exams, okay? And what he says is at each stage of our life, we have a task, when we're younger, middle age, and post-retirement and so on. When we get to the 4th quarter, wherever that is, the challenge is we want to move toward integrity and not despair. Sometimes people get to that 4th quarter and they get caught up in the woulda, the shoulda, the coulda, and they get overwhelmed with despair. My life meant nothing. It was a waste. Another way of looking at it is, I did what I could. I trusted God. I lived the best way that I could. We want to move toward hope. And one of the things about being aligned with Christianity, having a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ, is that it gives us a source of hope and strength. And when we do that work, when we apply that to the grief work, what it does is it empowers us to face, I think, our own eventual death, whenever that may be, whether it's sooner or much later, we don't know. It also gives us some tools for understanding this process well enough to come along somebody else who may be hurting, somebody who is a survivor. So that's kind of stated here. It's very important to take it up. If you don't know him personally, don't let another day go by, because we don't know when this life is going to end. And again, I'm not trying to be shocking here as much as I am just a realist when I say it's very important to do business with God and to make sure you have a relationship that is solid. We can draw from that, we can benefit from it, and we can face our own death as well as helping other people when we do that. So, two factors, sort of predictably here, but it's important to remember that two things influence the duration and the intensity of the grief process. Now, one of them you can say would be the depth. If there's a lot of depth in the relationship, and we lose somebody, it's going to hurt more. I mean, it kind of stands to reason. But, if we love more, potentially we're going to hurt more. And the other thing is the timing of the relationship, the timing of the death of the relationship. And this would be when somebody dies suddenly, like my wife was within about a 7-day period, that's more difficult to adjust to. I'm not sure it's any better or worse. I've talked to many people who have situations where they have relatives and friends, and they die over a period of time. That's bad in its own right, because you have to watch people go down. That may be one of us, and it may not. But one of the benefits, the trade-offs there when we die quickly, is that it's over. It's both the benefit and the cost. But we don't get to pick the day. And I mentioned the waves thing. We got to really, it's a way of kind of letting grief do its work somehow. And we factor these two in when we're assessing our own grief and also how to help other people. A book that I found extremely helpful is by H.N. Wright. He's a marriage and family therapist who's a great writer. And he's done a book called Experiencing Grief. Came out in 2004. Somebody gave this to me, and there's no shortage of good books on grief. I'll be honest, okay? This one was particularly helpful to me. But he said that there is like an inward and an outward process we want to pay attention to. The inward process would be the grief that everybody experiences when we go through loss. Everybody has grief. If we attach and then we have to unattach, it's going to hurt. And the more attached we are, the more it's going to hurt when we unattach. But the mourning part here, this would be kind of like the work of grief. And this has to do with the choices that we make, how we take care of ourselves, how we live our lives, how we adjust to this new beginning. We've got an ending, and now we've got a new beginning. And what are we doing with that? Are we good stewards, or are we poor stewards? So it's helpful to think about it as inward and outward, and the fact that we have choices. And again, I have to share a little bit of research with you here. There's two big things that I want to share in the time that we have here that I think are important because they're seminal contributions to what we understand about the impact of stressful events and grief in general. These two Navy physicians named Holmes and Ray in 1977 came up with a scale, and they were able to, by interviewing hundreds of people, they came up with a scale, and they quantified the impact of various things, like death of a spouse, predictably, is the most potent thing. Right there with it is death of a child. Some would say death of a child a little more so, but we don't want to quibble. Death of a spouse or a child is bad. Okay? Child probably a little bit worse when you think about it. But death of a child or death of a spouse would be the single most important thing. But importantly, in this assessment that they did, which has been modified many times over the years, and it's still around in some form or another. I've used it clinically for many years. I've used it in my classes. I continue to use it. If you compare it to things like dental work, getting fired, an automobile accident, conflict with a loved one, and so on and so forth, these guys came up with this rating scale, and what they found was that, again, top of the heap was death of a spouse, death of a child. But the cumulative number was found to be very suggestive of who would get sick and who didn't. If we have too much stress in our life, it overwhelms our vital energy. It overwhelms our life force. It overwhelms our capacity to fight off infections and potentially premature death. So it's important to kind of recognize that these stressful events can be cumulative, and the death of a spouse, death of a child kind of carries quite a while up here. I mean, again, we know that, but, we have empirical data that supports it. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross will be the other bit of research here. Now, she's not without controversy. She's a psychiatrist. She's deceased now, but she came up with these stages of grief that were originally the stages of death. And it was a very important study that she did. She's written something like 23 books. And the benefit of her work is that she was able to identify these things that we go through. Now, they're not hard and fast, but they are helpful. And it was originally in helping people to face death, but now they're understood more as a kind of a general framework for adapting to any kind of loss. And it may be any of the losses we've talked about: loss of a child, loss of a spouse, parent, grandparent, unborn fetus, and even a pet, a dear pet. Anytime we love something, we have the potential to hurt. But the Kubler-Ross, the caveat here, the major criticism of her work is that some people have said that she was a little too rigid about this sequence that we go through. And we don't want to take this too rigidly, okay? It's not a linear process, and it's not something that we want to approach too literally, but it's a guideline, okay? And these 5 steps start with denial. That was her word. We could say that denial has to do with, it's kind of like the cushion. It helps us to get our head around the fact that there's been a sudden and very dramatic change in our life with the loss of a loved one. It puts us into what we call a grief fog. It takes up so much bandwidth of our cognitive functioning that it's hard to make decisions. That's why family kind of comes around, and in my case, my family helped me make a lot of decisions about funeral and life celebration and what we were going to do moving this point forward. So it's a necessary step in the process. It's characterized mostly by shock and disbelief. Sometimes, however, people are angry. More often than not, what I've seen in clinical situations where people had anger following a death of a survivor, it was because a husband or a wife, for example, died and they didn't tell somebody about something. Maybe some money issues, estate issues. You didn't tell me about that. You abandoned me. You left me with all these decisions. And I didn't know how to do all that stuff. I thought you were taking care of it. And now they're gone. So there's a little bit of anger sometimes. Sometimes it's just unresolved conflicts. You know how many of us, we have conflicts. We aim to get to those conflicts, talk about them, maybe resolve them a little better, but it never quite happens. And then all of a sudden, somebody dies prematurely, and we don't get to have the conversation. So that anger is not a sin necessarily, unless, like it says in Ephesians, we hang on to it. We want to let it go as soon as possible, hopefully the same day. Bargaining is kind of a strange one. I'll mention this because it's so interesting here. It's a little bit like what Hezekiah did, King Hezekiah. This is like making deals with God. And what we know about it is, especially as people are approaching death, sometimes people will inexplicably, who are doomed to die on the same day, they'll last for 3 months or 6 months or a year. And many times it's related to, I want to be alive for this event, this graduation, this wedding, and I'm not going until that happens. It's kind of like they pray that and they work something out with God's sovereign will. It's rather mysterious, okay? But it happens. And the case in point also, it can happen on the other end. I had a set of grandparents. When I was a toddler, they both died. But my grandmother died, and they were both in their 80s. She died, and my grandfather was so distraught that he only made it 28 days without her. He was so identified with her that he just kind of gave up. And he stopped, having a will to live. Now, that's not advocated. They were godly men and women, but that was what they did. And it's just an example of how there's some things that go on there, when we approach our death, and want to be cognizant of that. The one that bears a little more explanation is sadness. Now, she used the word depression. This can be easily confused with clinical depression. It's not clinical depression necessarily. The sadness with grief is a little bit more related. It's more clearly related to cues, reminders, triggers, a song we hear, something we see, something we taste, something that we experience cognitively that remind us of what we lost. And it's very sad, the reality of the fact that it's gone. But that sadness is very different from clinical depression. Clinical depression would be when somebody feels worthless and they're self-loathing, they're not experiencing pleasure, and their self-esteem nosedives, and it's much more global and it's not tied to triggers so much. In clinical depression, self-esteem is, like I said, it plummets, whereas in grief, people may have some ups and downs, but they kind of keep the self-esteem, and they're able to enjoy things still, even though there's the ups and downs. Now, we'll tell you this, too, not to complicate it, but just to clarify, for people who go more than a year and they're still having prominent grief symptoms, clinically significant grief symptoms that are like above the standard mean, the standard deviation mean and so on, we call it prolonged grief disorder. Things do not get better within a year to the point that we're resolved, but they do tend to have, it tends to be a milestone, because that 1 year mark is where we see, we've gotten through the first Christmas, the first anniversary, the first birthday, and so on and so forth. Each year after that, it becomes a little bit more palatable. But this prolonged grief disorder is a new diagnosis. It came out in 2022 in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in the text revision version, and basically it's to describe those people who are just a little bit behind the curve. They're delayed in their grief response. It's a prolonged grief response. And people often ask me, well, what's the time limit here? There is really no time limit, but most experts will say 18 to 24 months, we've covered a lot of ground, and we should start to feel a little bit better about this new beginning, adjusting to life without our loved one. That's going to vary. As I said previously, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but it is something that we can sort of pay attention to. Acceptance is the new beginning, the new equilibrium we want to pay attention to. And what we want to focus on here, as we kind of wind down, what can we do? What does mourning look like? Okay, there's a couple of things we can do. Spiritually, we want to let go and let God. And two verses that are very helpful here. Actually, there's three. Psalm 46:10 says, don't fight it, cease striving. And the one that's been cited many times, Psalm 34:18 says, let God support us. Let him sustain us. Let him be confident in knowing that he's near to us. That verse was particularly helpful to me. And Psalm 90:12 said, Lord, teach us to number our days. We don't know what our number is. We don't know when our number is going to come up. It can come up prematurely. It can come up later. And that really is dependent on God's sovereign will. And we also want to talk about it. This can be very helpful. I have some guys that I ride bicycles with for recreation and for fitness. Ron Simmons is one. Grant Parks is another. Mike Brignola, who's since moved. These guys have listened to me talk a lot about Virginia's death. And they ministered to me in ways by letting me talk about that. Community groups can provide support. Howard and Mary Creek had me over for a meal. Mike and Rose Brignola had me over for a meal. That was extremely helpful in the weeks following Virginia's death. And that's the kind of thing that I would encourage you to do, to reach out for somebody, feed somebody. And it allows conversation. It was very helpful. My neighbor, Kathy, is her name. Kathy, I don't know if you're here, if you're listening, but when Virginia died, I had to, we'd been up all day and all night, and we were exhausted emotionally, but I wasn't really sleepy. And I was going to, as a courtesy, let her know that Virginia died. And she said, come on in. We talked for 2 hours. And I was able to unload a lot of things by talking to her. And she ministered to me in that way, my neighbor, Kathy. Who was good friends with Virginia. One of the things that's important to talk about is how our loved one died. And an important line that I read about this, a metaphor about baseball, says that no matter how many times we replay that ninth inning, the bottom of the ninth, we got to remember the game is over. It's okay to replay it, especially early on, but at some point we have to come to terms with the fact that the game is over. Now, stewardship, I think, involves moving beyond just talk. We don't want to talk it to death. We talk a lot at first, but I'm reminded of the great philosopher Toby Keith. You might have heard of him. He said, we need a little less talk and a lot more action. Well, the action is doing the grief work. And one of the things that's often not discussed about grief is that when all the family goes home, all the friends go home, and all the the attention dies down in the hours and days after funeral and death, we have to deal with it alone. And this verse is kind of sobering here. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. There's only so much that other people can do for us. Some of this has to take place solo. We don't want to isolate socially, but at the same time, at the end of the day, we're going to be alone. And we have to come to terms with the fact that we are indeed alone. Tincture of time is a medical phrase that has to do with the fact there's no there's no time limit. There's no fast track on grief work. And two things I want to share with you here. One of them is from my therapist. I went to counseling for a few sessions with a lady named Debbie Holt. She's associated with hospice. I think she's still working. She may be retired by now. She said, grief will be your traveling companion from here on out. But the edges are not so sharp as you get farther along. I didn't understand all that at first, but I understand it now in ways that were quite significant. C.S. Lewis, in his book, A Grief Observed, used an analogy of an amputee. No matter how skilled an amputee may be with their prosthetic, you can't even tell that they're an amputee. At the end of the day, when they take their leg off, they are reminded there's only one leg there, and that other leg is gone and not coming back. There's a finality to death that we have to do business with. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention Captain Obvious here. We sleep, we eat, we move. If we neglect these, we do so at our own peril. This is especially important in the grief process. So by way of summary, go back to the 3 N's there: natural, necessary, and normal. And grief is a statement that we love someone. It's nothing more than that. It's nothing less than that, though. We're reminded that God is with us. He wants to sustain us. He is near. He's accessible to us. His will, his sovereign will is not, but his word, his moral will is. And the depth of a relationship, as well as the timing of the death, can be complicating factors in some situations. And the due diligence of working through the stages, we don't want to take them rigidly, but we do want to take them, and just keep that in mind. Acceptance is our goal, but to kind of expand on acceptance, what I want to make clear is these emotional memories that are so sensitive and so difficult at first, unpleasant, they gradually morph into historical memories that are ours for life, so we can think about the loved one, the good times that we had, and not be, just torn up about it. And the other thing would be that the painful sadness early in loss gradually morphs into gratitude as we reflect on how blessed we were to have the relationship with the person who's deceased. That takes time. I'm a work in progress, but I share that with you as a goal that we have. If you've not had the If You Go First talk and you're an adult, especially in the fourth quarter, it's a good thing to do. And I would recommend that you do that. I'm going to close with this verse in Hebrews 10:23, which says, "Let us hold fast our confession of hope without wavering, because he who promised is faithful." Let's pray.